Only two Greek words are used for Jesus weeping in the entire New Testament, and almost every retelling defaults to the wrong one. One of those words shows up exactly once in the whole Bible. The other is far louder. The same verb used elsewhere for wailing at a funeral. Mix the two up, and you change the moment completely. Here is what you're actually reading, word by word, and it is not the version most people have heard. This is not a story about Jesus losing composure. This is not a story about weakness breaking through. This is not a story about sentiment added later by writers who wanted a softer Jesus. It is a story about exactly 3 recorded scenes, 3 different Greek verbs, and what each one is actually doing in the text. Start outside a small village called Bethany. A man named Lazarus has been dead 4 days. 4 days is not a random detail. In first-century Jewish belief, a person's spirit was thought to linger near the body for 3 days, still hoping for revival. Before departing once decay set in, 4 days meant the window was closed. Not delayed. Closed. A mini-how on the setting itself, tombs like this one were usually cut horizontally into rock, sealed with a flat stone disc rolled across a groove in the entrance, not a vertical grave. A sealed room, that detail matters for what comes later, and for why Martha, standing outside it, warns Jesus plainly that the body will already smell. Martha reaches Jesus first, on the road, before he even enters the village. Every gospel account that mentions the household gives Martha the role of running it. She is the one who serves, the one who manages, the one comfortable enough to argue theology with Jesus on an open road. She does not collapse. She argues, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died, pulling the conversation toward doctrine, toward resurrection, toward the last day. Doctrine is easier to hold than a body that will not answer when you call its name. Jesus answers her plainly. This exchange stays entirely in the head. Mary, usually pictured as the quieter of the two, uses almost the identical sentence Martha just used. But she does not argue it from a distance. She falls at his feet, and something shifts in Jesus that did not shift with Martha. John records it in an odd, layered phrase. He groaned in the spirit and was troubled. The underlying word is closer to indignation than composure, not gentle sorrow. Something nearer to visible agitation at what death has done. 2 verses later comes the line almost everyone has heard without ever really reading it. Jesus wept. Here is the word that gets skipped past. The Greek verb used here, dakrio, appears exactly once in the entire New Testament. Ons. Every other gospel scene of weeping uses a different, louder verb. Dakrio is quiet tears that surface, rather than tears that are performed. Its root sits in the same small word family as the tears named later in the book of Hebrews. Strong crying and tears, a rare thread of vocabulary. The New Testament reserves for grief, too honest to stage. Who? Here's what you'd expect he already knows. Out loud, before he ever reaches the tomb. That Lazarus is walking out of it within minutes. So why does he cry at all, you'd think? He of all people wouldn't need to. Here is where most retellings get the word wrong. Paintings, films, and more than a few sermons stage this scene with Jesus visibly shaking, sobbing, sometimes crying out loud in front of the crowd, borrowing the imagery that actually belongs to the louder verb, the one used later for Jerusalem. The text does not say that. It says dakrio, quiet, almost private, in the middle of a crowd. Get the verb right, and you have to throw out the entire visual you've been carrying around in your head. A mini-how worth knowing in first-century Jewish villages. Mourning was a public performance as much as a private feeling. The historian Josephus, in his account of Jewish customs of the period, describes hired mourners and flute players expected at any death, wailing loudly as a formal part of the ritual. Mary's tears, and the crowd's tears around her, were exactly what custom required. Jesus's were not. He was a guest in that house. Not family, nothing obligated this. He was not performing grief. He was catching someone else's. Notice, as you go, how the scale keeps escalating. This first scene is personal, one family, one tome, one grieving household. The next scene widens to national stakes, an entire city, and a documented siege. The last scene widens again to the night before, an event Christian theology treats as cosmic in scope. Same, 3 tiers. 3 completely different scales of what's actually at stake. And here is the twist most people miss entirely. Jesus is not crying because Lazarus is dead. He cannot be. He already knows the tomb will be empty in minutes. Read the verse again, and the tears land somewhere else, not on the death itself, but on the crowd standing in front of him, who still think death is the end of the story. He weeps over their grief, not his own certainty. That reframes the entire scene. This was never a man losing composure over a friend's death. It was a man weeping because everyone around him still believed in an ending he had already canceled. Stay with me. There's a second scene coming. And you'll notice it uses the opposite word entirely. If you've made it this far, drop the word tears in the comments, and I'll tell you which of the 2 Greek words I think fits whatever brought you here today. Move forward a few years. Jesus is descending the Mount of Olives on a borrowed colt, a crowd throwing branches ahead of him like a coronation, already decided. A mini-how on the geography, the road drops sharply just past the summit, and there is one specific point where the entire city becomes visible all at once: walls, temple, rooftops rather than gradually. The way most approaches to a hill city work. Pilgrims for centuries afterward marked that exact spot. That is almost certainly where Luke places what happens next. Jesus sees the whole city at once and weeps over it. This is not dekrio. The word here is kleo, louder, physical, the same verb used elsewhere in the Gospels for wailing at funerals. And for something else worth remembering, it is the exact word used later when Peter, standing in a courtyard after denying Jesus 3 times, goes out and weeps bitterly. The same verb for a king grieving a doomed city ends up describing a disciple grieving his own cowardice. Hold on to that detail. You'll want it later. Audible grief. In public. At the precise moment the crowd around him thinks it is watching a coronation, not a funeral. Here's what most people miss about this scene. He does not weep in vague or symbolic terms. He describes, in specific military language, a coming siege, a trench dug around the city, walls leveled, not one stone left standing on another. This isn't sentiment you're being handed. It is a description of an event that happened roughly 4 decades later, when Roman forces did exactly that. Josephus, in his eyewitness history, The Jewish War, describes Roman legions constructing a siege wall entirely around Jerusalem and later tearing down its structures stone by stone, matching the wording Luke records with unsettling precision, down to the detail of not one stone left on another. He is not weeping over an idea. He is weeping over a documented catastrophe. Most of the people cheering beside him have no framework yet to imagine. You've probably wept over something before it even happened. A diagnosis you saw coming weeks out. A goodbye you could feel arriving before anyone said the word out loud. That is closer to what this scene is describing than simple sadness. Pay attention to this, because you'll see it twice more before this is over. The 2 loudest recorded instances of Jesus' grief in the Gospels are not about his own coming death at all. One is a friend's tomb he is seconds from emptying. The other is a city that will reject the very thing that could have spared it. Neither time are the tears for himself. One scene is left, and this is the only one where the tears may finally include him. The night before the crucifixion, in an olive grove called Gethsemane, Jesus brings 3 men in closer than the rest: Peter, who will deny knowing him before sunrise; James, one of the 2 brothers he nicknamed Sons of Thunder; John, the youngest, later remembered as the one Jesus loved. He tells them his soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death, and asks them to stay awake. They do not. All 3 fall asleep, more than once. While he prays a short distance away, remember the callback: Peter is in this garden, asleep. Hours before he will use that same loud verb, klio, to describe his own weeping after the rooster crows. Tonight it is Jesus keeping vigil while Peter sleeps through it. In a few hours, the roles will not exactly reverse, but the same word, the loud one, will land squarely on the man who could not manage to stay awake for this. A second mini-how, the name Gethsemane itself, comes from a Hebrew Aramaic phrase meaning, roughly, oil press. This was a working olive grove, the kind of place where olives were crushed under enormous stone weight to force oil out of them. Jesus prays that night in a garden named for the act of being crushed until something is forced out. Whether or not the gospel writers intended the echo, it is difficult to unhear once you know it. Luke's account, present in the majority of ancient manuscripts, though a minority of early copies omit the verse, which is worth stating plainly, rather than glossing over, describes his sweat becoming, as it were, great drops of blood falling down to the ground. The United Bible Society's Greek New Testament Committee, whose job is precisely this kind of manuscript comparison, lists this verse among the clearest candidates for an early scribal edition. Based on its absence from several of the oldest manuscript families, modern medicine has a name for the physical phenomenon described either way, hematohydrosis, a documented condition in which extreme physiological stress ruptures the tiny blood vessels around sweat glands, releasing blood mixed with sweat. Case reports of its surface periodically in dermatology and forensic medicine literature, rare, but real, documented in living patients under extreme fear or physical trauma, not invented for drama. The Book of Hebrews, written afterward, describes this same night as prayers offered with strong crying and tears. The Greek noun for crying out here, krauge, comes from the same root family as krazo, the verb used elsewhere in the Gospels when someone cries out to Jesus in desperation, including the loud cry Jesus himself makes from the cross hours later, asking why he has been forsaken. Samarut. 3 different scenes, each one louder than the last. Before we land this, I want a one-word answer from you in the comments. In Gethsemane, do you think the tears are mostly for what is coming for him, or mostly for what it will cost everyone he is about to leave behind? Scripture does not resolve that cleanly. It reads like both, tangled together. You probably know a version of this yourself, a night you cried where nobody could see, and told no one the next morning. Jesus' version of that had 3 men 20 feet away, asleep, one of whom would deny knowing him within hours. For the modern parallel, picture a hospital corridor at the Texas Medical Center in Houston. At 2 a.m, a man stands just outside a waiting room, jaw tight, phone in one hand, trying to compose his face before he walks back in to people who are watching to see how he is handling it. Sam instinct, 2,000 years apart, the reflex to treat visible grief as something requiring an apology. Jesus offers no such apology. Not at a tomb, not over a city, not alone in a garden at night. So here is what the record actually shows. Once counted honestly, not endless weeping, not a man defined by sorrow, a small, specific set of scenes, 3, clearly located where the tears surface, and every time, something larger than his own comfort sits behind them. First, the text does not soften or explain away these moments, and it does not use the same word twice. 3 scenes, 3 distinct verbs, each carrying its own weight. The record treats this as precise, not incidental, part of what it means that he was fully human, not partly. Second, the tears are almost never for himself. First, a grieving sister who has just watched a body sealed in rock, a city that will not see what is coming until Roman siege engines are already at the wall. 3 friends who cannot manage to stay conscious for him on the one night he asked, one of whom is hours from weeping that same loud verb over his own failure instead. Third, and the one worth carrying out of this video, the same face that wept in near silence at a friend's tomb, also wept loudly enough that a gospel writer thought it worth recording the sound of it, over a city that would reject him days later, and then, alone at night in a garden, wept, hardest of all, in words too raw for the 3 men nearby to even hear. Not performance, not weakness, Not a detail anyone in the text needed to quietly edit out, and the callback resolves here. Quietly, the same loud verb that described Jesus weeping over an entire doomed city, is the exact word Matthew and Luke both choose for Peter. Later, alone, having just betrayed the one person who never once asked him for anything except to stay awake, two very different failures, a city that would not see, a disciple who could not stand watch, described with the identical Greek verb. That is not an accident of vocabulary. It is the writers pointing, quietly, at the same category of grief. I want to be direct about something before we close. Everything here is my own study of these 4 passages. It does not speak for every church, every tradition, or every scholar. And I could be wrong on some of the finer manuscript questions, especially around the disputed verse in Luke. I'm not asking you to take my word for any of it. Go read the 4 scenes yourself, slowly, in whatever translation you own, and see whether the quiet word and the loud word land where I've placed them for you. So tell me, honestly, of the 3, which one lands hardest on you? The quiet tears at a tomb, the loud grief over a city, or the private agony in a garden where no one else was even awake to see it? Answer with one word if that's easier for you. I read every single one, because underneath the Greek verbs and the manuscript footnotes, it comes down to one thing: a face, wet with tears, that looked no different from anyone else's. God bless you.